Sunday dinners at the Sterling estate were always a performance, a grand, elaborate act where my mother, Eleanor Sterling, sat at the head of the table like a queen on her throne, entertaining guests and subtly reminding everyone of her power. Tonight was no different. The dining hall was bathed in warm candlelight, reflecting off the polished silverware and delicate crystal glasses. The chandelier overhead cast a golden hue across the long table, where plates of meticulously arranged gourmet dishes lay untouched, more for appearance than appetite. My mother raised her glass, an aged Bordeaux she reserved for special occasions, and smiled, the kind of smile that carried daggers behind its sweetness. "Poor David," she mused, swirling the wine in her glass as if she were contemplating something profound. "Going bankrupt so soon." A ripple of polite laughter traveled down the table. I felt my jaw tighten, but I didn't respond. There was no point. "I told you he'd never be good enough for our family, Mary." My mother's voice was laced with faux pity, her eyes sharp as she turned toward my wife. I glanced at Mary, waiting for her reaction. She remained still, composed, her expression unreadable. She didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't take the bait. Instead, she picked up her wine glass, took a slow sip, and set it down gently, her movements careful and deliberate. I knew my mother hated that. Eleanor thrived on provocation, on pushing people until they cracked, until they gave her the reaction she wanted. Mary's silence was a denial of her power. The conversation around the table carried on, but I could feel the weight of my mother's gaze still fixed on Mary. "I suppose it was inevitable," she continued, feigning concern. "Retail is such an unpredictable business. I did warn you, didn't I? It takes a certain caliber of person to run something truly lasting. Not everyone is meant for leadership." Another sip of wine. Another unreadable smile from Mary. "You were right, Eleanor," she said mildly. "It does take a certain kind of person." Something about the way she said it made my mother's expression flicker for the briefest moment. Uncertainty, perhaps, but she quickly recovered. I hated this. Hated sitting at this table, listening to my mother disguise her cruelty behind thinly veiled politeness, watching her humiliate my wife in front of an audience that would never dare challenge her. But I stayed silent. I wanted to believe it was out of necessity, that speaking up would only make things worse for Mary, that I had to pick my battles carefully. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. The truth was, I had spent my entire life under my mother's thumb, conditioned to avoid conflict, to avoid disappointing her, to avoid making waves in a world where Eleanor Sterling's word was law. And yet, Mary sat beside me, unmoving, unfazed. I had never known anyone like her. "Have you given any thought to your next steps?" My mother asked, her tone dripping with saccharine condescension. "Perhaps something smaller? A little boutique, maybe?" This time, Mary smiled, and for the first time that evening, it wasn't the careful, controlled smile she had worn all night. It was something else, something knowing. "I have a few things in the works," she said simply. The way she said it made something twist uncomfortably in my gut. My mother gave an exaggerated sigh. "Well, you're resilient. I'll give you that. But sometimes, dear, it's best to know when to walk away gracefully." Mary nodded slowly, her fingers brushing over the stem of her wine glass. "You're right," she said. "Timing is everything." My mother seemed pleased with herself, taking another sip of wine. I glanced at Mary again, but she didn't meet my eyes. Dinner continued as usual, the guests engaging in idle conversation, the Sterling family performing their carefully curated roles. But something had shifted in the air, something I couldn't quite place. As we got up to leave, my mother pulled me aside, her voice lowered. "You know, David," she murmured, "Victoria Hayes has been asking about you since she got back in town. She always had such a fondness for you." I stiffened. So this was where the evening was headed. "Mary and I are fine," I said flatly. "Of course," she said, her voice dripping with false understanding. "But given her situation now, I imagine she'd want what's best for you. And you deserve to be with someone who can keep up, don't you think?" I exhaled sharply through my nose, shoving my hands into my pockets. "Good night, Mother." She smiled, stepping back as if the conversation had never happened. Mary was waiting for me by the car, her coat draped over her shoulders. She looked up as I approached, her face still unreadable. "I don't know why she's like this," I muttered as I unlocked the door. "I should have said something." Mary turned to me, her lips parting slightly as if she were about to say something. But then she stopped. Instead, she reached for my hand, squeezed it briefly, and said, "Everything's going to change soon." The way she said it sent a shiver up my spine. I didn't know what she meant at the time, but I would. Tomorrow, everything would change. I used to believe my mother's disapproval of Mary was just an adjustment phase, one of those inevitable struggles when two strong-willed women clash. I told myself that given time, they'd find common ground, some unspoken truce, but I was wrong. It wasn't about time. It wasn't about Mary proving herself. It was never going to happen, because Eleanor Sterling had already made up her mind the moment I brought Mary home for the first time. She didn't see a brilliant entrepreneur. She didn't see a woman who had built a successful boutique chain, Bellamode, from the ground up, someone whose work had been featured in fashion magazines, who had the industry's attention. No, all my mother saw was an outsider. Someone who wasn't part of the old money social circles she deemed acceptable. "You don't marry down, David," she told me once in a voice so cold it barely sounded like my mother. "You don't build an empire only to dilute it." I had argued, of course. Told her that Mary wasn't some desperate social climber, that she was independent, driven, self-made. That was what I loved about her. But my mother didn't hear a word I said. She had already decided that Mary was a mistake. And when Eleanor Sterling decided someone was a mistake, she made sure they felt it. At first, the sabotage was so subtle that even I had trouble seeing it. She'd make offhand comments to her circle of friends, planting doubts in their minds about Mary's business. "It's a lovely little shop," she'd say with a small smile, "but I've heard they've been struggling with quality issues. Such a shame." Within weeks, rumors started circulating in the fashion world. Key suppliers who once worked with Mary suddenly raised their prices or outright canceled their contracts. When she pressed them for reasons, the responses were always vague: "We're restructuring," or "We're shifting focus." None of it made sense. Not until Mary connected the dots. "I have proof," she told me one night, her voice steady but her eyes burning with something deeper. Anger, hurt. "Your mother's behind this." I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. I told myself it was paranoia, that my mother had no reason to waste her energy on something so petty. But Mary wasn't paranoid. She was prepared. She started recording everything. Every casual phone call where my mother encouraged suppliers to reconsider their partnerships with Bellamode. Every landlord meeting where rental agreements were suddenly revoked at the last minute. Every whispered conversation where my mother nudged people toward better investments, ones that conveniently didn't include Mary. Mary didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, she kept collecting evidence, building a case. And while my mother was busy pulling strings to cripple Mary's business, Mary was making her own moves. I didn't know it at the time, but she had already started acquiring shares in Sterling Couture through a web of private investment firms. But before we get there, I need to talk about the worst blow. The moment that broke Mary, not permanently, but enough to change something in her. 6 months ago, Bellamode had secured a major deal, one that would have taken her boutique chain to the next level. A luxury brand collaboration, something that would have put her name on the map in a way that no amount of Eleanor Sterling's sabotage could erase. It was finalized, contracts signed, marketing materials prepped, and then, out of nowhere, the brand pulled out. Mary sat in stunned silence in her office as the email came through. "Due to unforeseen changes in strategy, we regret to inform you that we will no longer be proceeding with the partnership." Unforeseen changes? That night, she didn't say much. We had dinner, barely spoke. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even sad. She was just quiet. It wasn't until I was getting ready for bed that I saw her sitting at the desk in our home office, staring at her laptop screen. I walked over, leaned down, and then I saw it. The proof. Emails. Dozens of them. Phone call logs. Meetings she wasn't supposed to know about. And in every single one, my mother's fingerprints were all over it. I swallowed hard. I knew what this meant. There was no excusing it. No pretending this was just an overprotective mother worried about her son's future. This was calculated destruction. She killed it, Mary said softly, her fingers brushing the laptop screen. Your mother made one call and burned everything I built to the ground. I didn't know what to say. My stomach twisted painfully because deep down, I knew she was right. And worse, I had let it happen. By not standing up for her, by not forcing my mother to back off, I had allowed this. I had enabled it. I reached out, touching Mary's shoulder. She turned to me then, and something in her eyes stopped me cold. It wasn't just sadness. It was something sharper. No, she said. You don't get to apologize. I flinched. I want you to remember this moment, she continued, her voice calm but full of something dangerous. Because I do. She closed her laptop, stood up, and walked past me. And just like that, the conversation was over. I didn't realize it then, but that was the night everything shifted. That was the moment Mary stopped trying to fight my mother head-on and started playing the long game. Over the next few months, while my mother continued to gloat, thinking she had finally succeeded in driving Mary out, Mary was making her own moves. She started studying my mother's empire, learning its weaknesses, its alliances, its loyalties. And one by one, she quietly infiltrated the board. By the time my mother was raising her wine glass at that family dinner, toasting Mary's failure, she had already lost. She just didn't know it yet. And when she found out, well, it wouldn't be pretty. I always thought business was about numbers, about profit margins, stock values, and market shares. But I was wrong. Business, at least the way my mother played it, was about power. And the one thing Eleanor Sterling loved more than anything else was control. For years, she had ruled Sterling Couture with an iron grip, turning it into one of the most sought-after luxury brands in the country. Every decision, every expansion, every strategic move, she had the final say. She was untouchable. Until Mary decided to change the game. I didn't realize what was happening at first. Mary never once showed her hand. She didn't argue with my mother, didn't confront her about the sabotage, didn't fight back the way she had in the beginning. Instead, she did something I never expected. She disappeared. Not physically. She was still here, still my wife, still attending social events, still playing the perfect, graceful woman my mother underestimated. But professionally, she went quiet. For months, she stopped talking about Bella Mode. She never mentioned the lost suppliers, the collapsed deals, or the rent hikes. It was as if she had accepted defeat. And my mother, ever the victor, grew comfortable in her supposed win. That was her first mistake. Behind closed doors, Mary was working. Not on reviving her boutique chain, not on rebuilding the empire my mother had crushed, but on taking hers instead. Mary had spent years networking in the industry, forging relationships my mother never paid attention to. The old money crowd never took Mary seriously, dismissing her as new money with small ambitions. But while they ignored her, their business associates didn't. The investors, the silent partners, the shareholders my mother had taken for granted, assuming they would always remain loyal. Mary studied them. She found the cracks. And then, she started buying. Not under her name, of course. My mother would have caught on to that in an instant. No, Mary was smarter than that. She used investment firms, shell companies with no apparent connection to her. Each firm was completely independent. Each purchase small enough not to raise suspicion. But one by one, they stacked up. By the time my mother noticed anything unusual, it was too late. Sterling Couture had always been a family business, but it wasn't solely hers. She controlled the largest stake, but not all of it. Over the years, in order to finance expansions, she had sold off shares to investors, confident that no one could ever hold more power than her. She was wrong. Mary had orchestrated the perfect coup. Over the course of a year, she had silently acquired 65% of Sterling Couture through various holding companies, giving her the majority control. It was untraceable at first, because the shares were scattered, hidden behind multiple firms, none of which seemed related. But when the final piece fell into place, all the firms transferred their voting rights to one person. Mary, my wife, the woman my mother had called a failure and a mistake, now owned the empire she had spent decades building. And the best part? My mother never saw it coming. While she was busy celebrating her so-called victory over Mary, while she was mocking her at that family dinner, Mary had already won. I didn't know the details yet. Mary hadn't told me what she was planning. Not because she didn't trust me, but because she needed my reaction to be genuine. She knew my mother better than I did. She knew Eleanor would sense any hesitation, any shift in behavior. And if I had known, if I had even suspected what was coming, I wouldn't have been able to hide it. So she protected me the only way she could, by keeping me in the dark. But tomorrow morning, at 9 a.m., I would find out everything. And so would my mother. I couldn't stop thinking about Mary's words from last night. Everything's going to change soon. I had thought she was talking about us, about my mother finally backing off, maybe giving us some space. I was wrong. She wasn't waiting for my mother to step aside. She was taking everything from her. And when Eleanor Sterling walked into her boardroom tomorrow morning, she would no longer be in control of her own company. For the first time in her life, my mother was about to lose. And she had no idea. The air at the Sterling estate was thick with arrogance. My mother sat at the head of the grand dining table, sipping her wine with a satisfied smirk. She thought she had won. She thought she had broken Mary, that my wife had accepted her fate and slunk away like a defeated competitor. She had no idea she was about to be ruined. I wasn't sure why Mary agreed to dinner that night. After all the humiliations, the cutting remarks, the constant reminders that she wasn't worthy of the Sterling name, she should have refused. But she had simply smiled, touched my hand, and said, "It'll be an interesting evening." Now, watching her from across the table, I could tell something was different. She wasn't tense like before. She wasn't wary of my mother's games. She was waiting, patient, as if she already knew how the night would unfold. That unsettled me. Mary wasn't the same woman who had once believed that hard work alone could win my mother's respect. That woman had died the night she realized Eleanor Sterling was behind the collapse of her business. The woman sitting here tonight? She wasn't here to win my mother over. She was here to end her. I just didn't know how yet. My mother, of course, was oblivious. She basked in the glow of what she thought was a flawless victory, leaning in with her usual brand of polished cruelty. "I must say, Mary," she mused, swirling her wine, "I admire your resilience. Many women in your position would have walked away by now." Mary arched an eyebrow, her lips twitching slightly. "In my position?" My mother let out a delicate laugh, the kind that made people lean in as if she were about to say something terribly clever. "Oh dear, you know what I mean. It can't be easy, watching everything slip away. But, of course, some people just aren't meant for this level of success." I felt my hands clench into fists beneath the table. Mary, on the other hand, simply reached for her glass. "I suppose that's true," she said smoothly. "Some people really don't know how to hold on to what they've built." For the first time, something flickered across my mother's face, just for a second. A sliver of uncertainty. But she recovered quickly, smiling as if Mary had just proven her point. "You see, David," she turned to me, tilting her head, "this is what I've been trying to teach you. There are winners and losers in this world. The ones who adapt, and the ones who get left behind." I hated that she said that in front of Mary, that she looked at my wife as if she were already a relic of the past, something insignificant, forgettable. Mary said nothing for a moment. Then she set her glass down carefully and leaned in slightly, her voice soft but deadly. "You're absolutely right, Eleanor," she said. "Timing is everything." My mother's smile froze. Just for a fraction of a second, Mary held her gaze, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. She knew something my mother didn't, something that made her so damn calm. I couldn't take it anymore. "What are you getting at, Mary?" I asked, my voice lower than I intended. She looked at me then, her expression unreadable. She didn't answer, but I saw the briefest flicker of something in her eyes, pity. Not for herself, for me. Because whatever was about to happen, I wasn't ready for it. Then, as if on cue, my mother shifted gears. "Enough of all this business talk," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Let's talk about your future, David." My stomach tightened. I knew what was coming. My mother's next move had been in motion for months. Victoria Hayes, the perfect Sterling woman, old money, impeccably bred, recently divorced and conveniently back in town. The woman my mother had been pushing toward me since the moment Mary's business collapsed. She's been asking about you, you know, my mother continued, refilling her glass with an indulgent sip. She always had such a fondness for you. I told her it's such a shame how things have turned out, but perhaps there's still hope. Mary didn't react. I did. Mother, I said tightly. Don't. Oh, David, she sighed dramatically, as if I were being ridiculous. I'm only saying sometimes, first choices aren't the best choices. You're still young. You shouldn't feel trapped just because of a situation that didn't work out. I felt my pulse pound in my ears. But Mary? She smiled. I agree, she said lightly. You should never let yourself be trapped. My mother blinked, caught off guard by the ease of Mary's response. Mary stood, adjusting the napkin on her lap before placing it neatly on the table. Well, this has been lovely, she said, but I have an early meeting tomorrow. My mother's eyes gleamed. Oh, a corporate consulting meeting, Mary replied. I knew that was a lie. Mary hadn't worked with another company since Bellamode collapsed, and my mother knew it too. Her smile sharpened. That's nice, dear. Perhaps something more suited to your skills? Retail sales, maybe? Mary tilted her head, considering her for a moment. Then she simply said, Perhaps. Tomorrow should be interesting. There was something in her tone, something my mother didn't catch, but I did. I watched as Mary turned to me, her hand brushing my arm. Ready to go? She asked. I nodded, still unsure of what I was feeling. But as we walked toward the door, my mother leaned in just enough for me to hear her final words. You remember how close you and Victoria were, don't you? I clenched my jaw. She wanted me to react. She wanted Mary to hear. Mary didn't even pause. She turned slightly, her lips curling into the smallest, knowing smile. Thank you for dinner, Eleanor, she said. You've taught me so much about business. Then she walked out the door, leaving my mother watching after her, expression slightly confused, slightly wary. It was the first time I had ever seen Eleanor Sterling hesitate. She didn't know what was coming, but I did. Because whatever happened tomorrow, Mary had already won. I was never a morning person, but that morning, I was wide awake by 5 a.m., staring at the ceiling, my mind tangled in thoughts I couldn't escape. Something was coming. Something big. I could feel it in the way Mary had held herself last night. The way she smiled at my mother's insults. The way she didn't flinch when Eleanor suggested I find someone else. The way she walked out of that dinner as if she had already won. I just didn't know what the victory was yet. Beside me, Mary was already up, sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair with slow, deliberate movements. She looked at peace, like someone who had spent months constructing a puzzle and was now placing the final piece. You should get dressed, she said without looking at me. I sat up. For what? She finally turned to face me, her expression unreadable. For the board meeting. I frowned. The Sterling Couture board meeting? I don't have anything to do with that. She gave me a small, almost sympathetic smile. You will. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Mary, I said carefully, what's going on? She stood, walked over to me, and placed her hands on my shoulders. I had never seen her look more powerful, more in control. Trust me, she said softly. I wasn't sure why, but those words made my pulse quicken. I did as she asked. By 8:45 a.m., we were at the Sterling Couture headquarters. I hadn't set foot in my mother's company in years. It wasn't my world. It never had been. But today, I followed Mary into the tall glass building, ignoring the way heads turned as we walked through the marble lobby. I didn't understand why we were here. Not until we stepped into the boardroom, and I saw Mary take my mother's usual seat. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a meeting. This was a coup. One by one, the board members filed in, their eyes shifting between Mary and the empty chair my mother usually occupied. There was tension in the air, a waiting silence, as if they all knew something was coming, but weren't sure what. The door opened, and there she was. Eleanor Sterling, the woman who had spent her entire life controlling everything around her, walked in with the same air of power she always carried, until she saw Mary sitting at the head of the table. She froze. Christine, she said, her voice like ice. "What are you doing here?" Mary smiled. "Take a seat, Eleanor." A murmur rippled through the board members. My mother blinked, glancing at the other executives as if expecting them to step in. None of them did. Her gaze snapped back to Mary. "That's my seat." Mary tilted her head. "Not anymore." For the first time in my life, I saw my mother hesitate. She wasn't used to this, to someone challenging her authority in a room full of her own people. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but—" "It's not a game," a voice interrupted smoothly. I turned. Lucas, Mary's lawyer, was standing by the door, flipping open a file with calm precision. "As of this morning," he said, "Mary Parker is the majority shareholder of Sterling Couture." The room erupted in whispers. My mother's face drained of color. "That's impossible," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I would know if someone was buying up shares." Mary leaned forward, folding her hands neatly on the table. "Would you?" I watched as realization dawned on my mother's face. Slow, painful, terrifying. She turned back to Lucas. "How much?" she demanded. Lucas didn't blink. 65%. 65. The number hit my mother like a gunshot. It was over. Mary wasn't challenging my mother's authority. She owned it now. The other board members were silent, watching the unfolding disaster like spectators at a war they had no stake in. My mother trembled. You did this," she whispered, staring at Mary like she was seeing her for the first time. Mary's voice was calm, emotionless. "You spent years trying to destroy my business, Eleanor. You ruined my partnerships. You blacklisted me from my own industry. You tried to make me disappear." She leaned in slightly. "So I did the only thing I could do. I bought the one thing you never thought I could take. Sterling Couture. My mother's life's work. Her empire." My mother turned to me. "David," she gasped, "tell me you didn't know about this." I felt my stomach twist. "I didn't," I admitted. That hurt her more than anything. She had spent her life controlling me, always believing that no matter what happened, I would stand by her side. But today, I wasn't standing with her. I was standing with Mary. She turned back to my wife, her face pale. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice hollow. Mary sat back in her chair. "What I've earned," she said simply. "Control of this company. A future that you tried to take from me. And I want you to know exactly how it feels to have everything taken away." A thick silence filled the boardroom. Lucas slid a stack of papers across the table. "You have a choice, Eleanor," he said. "Sign the severance agreement and leave quietly, or fight it. And watch every single email, every recorded call, every illegal sabotage tactic be released to the public." My mother's hands shook as she reached for the papers. She had lost. And for the first time in her life, she knew it. By the time she signed her name, she wasn't CEO anymore. Mary was. And Sterling Couture? It belonged to her now. I had seen my mother in many moods. Furious, triumphant, manipulative, even cruel. But never like this. She sat frozen, her manicured fingers gripping the severance documents she had just signed. The pen in her hand trembled slightly, betraying what she fought so hard to conceal. She was in shock. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Sterling had lost. And not just to anyone, but to the woman she had spent years trying to erase. Mary. She had outmaneuvered my mother at her own game, and none of us had seen it coming. The boardroom was deathly silent. Every executive in the room exchanging glances, waiting for someone, anyone, to break the tension. But no one dared. My mother slowly set the pen down, inhaling deeply, composing herself. Then, her eyes locked onto me. "You knew about this," she accused, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated. "I didn't." Her nostrils flared. "You're lying." "I'm not." Mary had kept me in the dark, and I understood why. If I had known, I might have warned my mother, out of instinct, out of obligation. Because despite everything, despite the cruelty and the manipulation, she was still my mother. But Mary? Mary hadn't given me the option to choose. She had made sure my reaction was authentic, so my mother would believe every second of my shock and betrayal. And looking at my mother now, I realized that was the final nail in her coffin. She had lost her company. But more than that, she had lost control over me. She turned back to Mary, her face twisted in rage and disbelief. You planned this from the beginning, didn't you? Mary's voice was calm, unbothered. Not from the beginning. But once you made it clear you'd never let me succeed, I adapted. A muscle twitched in my mother's jaw. You married my son just to get to me. I felt something inside me snap. No, I said sharply. She married me because she loved me. You're the one who turned it into a war. Mary didn't look at me, but I saw her fingers tighten slightly against the table. My mother shook her head, still reeling, still searching for something to hold on to. You knew, David, she whispered. You must have known. I exhaled, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't. But if I had... She went silent. If I had known what you did to Mary, I continued, my hands clenching into fists. If I had seen the proof, the contracts, the threats, the sabotage, I leaned forward. I would have stopped you myself. Her eyes darkened. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She knew I meant it. She knew she had pushed too far. The board members were still watching, silent spectators in a war that had finally come to its conclusion. I could see some of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others with hidden satisfaction in their eyes. Because my mother hadn't just made enemies out of Mary. She had made enemies within her own walls. People who had been waiting for this moment, and Mary had given it to them. Lucas, her lawyer, cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. The transition will take effect immediately. Eleanor, your severance package is outlined in the final documents. You may review it with your legal team. My mother let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. You think I'll just walk away? Mary met her gaze without flinching. You don't have a choice. The air shifted. My mother stared at her, truly stared, and for the first time, I saw something else in her expression. Not just anger, not just defeat, fear, not of losing money, not of losing status, fear of irrelevance. Because that's what this was. She wasn't just being removed, she was being replaced. My mother stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. You think you're better than me, she seethed. You think because you pulled off this little scheme that you've won. Mary didn't blink. I know I've won. The air went cold. The words hit harder than anything else. My mother turned to me one last time. And you're fine with this? She demanded. You're fine letting her take everything I built? I looked at her, really looked at her. She had spent years controlling my life. Years convincing me that I owed her everything, that her success was my success, that I should be grateful for the name she had given me. But looking at Mary, at what she had done, what she had survived, what she had built for herself in the face of sabotage, I knew one thing for certain. My mother had never built anything for me. She had built for herself. And now, it was time for someone else to take control. I'm not losing anything, I said simply. You are. Her face twisted, pain flashing for just a second before she turned sharply on her heel and strode toward the door. No one stopped her. No one said a word. The moment she was gone, the tension in the room broke. One of the executives let out a breath. Another shuffled his papers, finally looking at Mary for the first time. Not as an outsider, but as the new boss. Lucas took his seat beside Mary and tapped the agenda in front of him. Now that leadership has been transferred, let's discuss the company's future. Mary leaned back in her chair, exuding quiet authority. I watched her, trying to process everything that had just happened. My mother was gone. Mary was CEO of Sterling Couture, and I was still struggling to catch up. She glanced at me, her eyes softening for just a moment. Then she turned back to the board. The war was over. And Mary? She had one. The car ride home was silent. I kept my hands on the wheel, gripping it tighter than I needed to. The city blurred past, but my mind was still in that boardroom, still replaying everything that had just happened. My mother was gone. Mary was now CEO of Sterling Couture, and I had just watched the most powerful woman I had ever known crumble in front of me. I should have felt relief. Maybe even justice, but all I felt was emptiness. Mary sat beside me, her gaze fixed out the window. She hadn't spoken since we left. I finally exhaled, loosening my grip. Are you okay? She turned to me, her expression unreadable. Then, softly, she said, "You don't have to feel guilty." I swallowed hard. "I don't." She didn't say anything, but the slight tilt of her head told me she knew I was lying. Because the truth was, I did feel guilty. Not because my mother had lost. Not because Mary had won. But because I had spent years standing in the middle, pretending like I didn't have to choose. Pretending like if I just stayed quiet, things would fix themselves. They hadn't. They had only gotten worse. And now, my mother had nothing left. I knew how much Sterling Couture meant to her. She had spent her entire life building it from the ground up, sacrificing everything to make it one of the most powerful fashion empires in the country. She didn't have friends, not real ones. She didn't have family, not in the way most people did. Sterling Couture was her entire world, and Mary had just taken it from her. It wasn't that I didn't believe my mother deserved it. I had seen what she did to Mary, how she tried to break her. I had seen the proof, the sabotage, the manipulation. But she was still my mother, and that was a hard thing to erase. When we got home, Mary disappeared into her office without a word. I stood in the kitchen, staring at nothing, my mind still tangled in the weight of everything. Then, for reasons I couldn't explain, I pulled out my phone, and I called her. She answered on the first ring. "So," my mother said, her voice hollow, "did you call to gloat?" I sighed. "No." She let out a dry laugh. "Then why?" I hesitated. I wanted to know where you are." A long silence stretched between us. Then she exhaled, the kind of breath that sounded more like a defeat than an answer. "My country house," she muttered. "What's left of my world." Her voice was flat, empty. I could picture her now, sitting in that massive estate, staring at nothing, the weight of her loss pressing in from all sides. Eleanor Sterling was many things, but she was never powerless. Until now. I ran a hand over my face. "You don't have to disappear." She laughed, bitter and sharp. "Don't I?" I had no answer to that. She sighed again, and for the first time in my life, I heard something in her voice that I had never heard before. Regret. "You were right, you know," she said quietly. I frowned. "About what?" She hesitated. Then, softer than I expected, she said, "I pushed too far." It wasn't an apology. My mother wasn't capable of those. But it was the closest thing to one I would ever get. I didn't know what to say. For years, I had wanted her to admit it, wanted her to acknowledge what she had done to Mary, to me, to all the people she had controlled and manipulated. But now that she had, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like mourning. My mother had spent so much time fighting to stay in power, she had never considered what would happen if she lost it all. And now that she had no idea who she was without it. "I suppose this is the part where you tell me I deserved it," she murmured. I sighed. "Would it change anything if I did?" A pause. "No." Then, quieter, she said, "Is Mary happy?" The question caught me off guard. I turned, glancing toward the office where Mary was. The door was closed, but I could picture her inside, sitting at her desk, reviewing her plans for Sterling Couture. She had one. But was she happy? I didn't know. "She should be," I answered. "She fought for it." Another long silence. Then my mother said, softer than I had ever heard her, "I underestimated her." And just like that, the conversation was over. When I hung up, I stood there for a long time, staring at my phone, wondering if this was the last time my mother and I would ever really talk. When I finally went upstairs, I found Mary still in her office, flipping through a set of board reports. She looked up as I leaned against the doorframe. "How do you feel?" I asked. She studied me for a long moment before finally answering. "I don't know." That was the truth. She had one. But it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something just beginning. And we had no idea what came next. 1 year later, I stood in what had once been my mother's office. It was different now. The heavy, ornate furniture my mother had insisted on, gone. The dark, suffocating mahogany that had made the office feel more like a fortress than a workspace, replaced. In its place was something lighter, something new. It wasn't just an office anymore. It was Mary's office. She stood by the window, her back to me, reviewing quarterly reports with the kind of focus that had once made my mother untouchable. Sterling Couture wasn't just surviving under Mary's leadership. It was thriving. Sales were up. The brand had expanded into new international markets. The stock price had soared, and the whispers had faded. The whispers from my mother's old social circle, the ones who had gloated when they thought Mary had failed. The ones who had called her a temporary inconvenience, a woman who would never last, never hold real power. Now, those same people were lining up to meet with her. Because power doesn't disappear. It shifts. And Mary had claimed it all. She finally turned, meeting my gaze. "You've been staring for a while," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Just trying to figure out if you're happy yet." Her expression flickered for the briefest moment. I had asked her that same question a year ago, after she had taken everything from my mother. Back then, she hadn't had an answer. Now, she set the reports down and gave me a small, knowing smile. "I think I'm getting there," she admitted. It wasn't the answer I expected, because winning and happiness aren't the same thing. She had fought for this, spent years building her empire in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And she had won. But victory is a strange thing. It doesn't always feel the way you think it will. And even when the war is over, you're still left with the aftermath. A buzz from Mary's phone broke the silence. She glanced at the screen, her expression unreadable. Then she handed me the phone. It was my mother. I let out a slow breath, taking the phone from her hand. "She still calls you?" Mary shrugged. "Every now and then." That surprised me. My mother had spent years trying to erase Mary from our lives, and now, she was reaching out to her instead of me. I didn't know how to feel about that. I stepped out onto the balcony before answering. The voice on the other end was quieter than I remembered. "I see the company's doing well," my mother said without greeting. I let out a dry laugh. "That's all you have to say?" A pause. "She's done better than I expected," she admitted. "I can't say I'm surprised." That caught me off guard. For a long time, I had assumed my mother hated Mary, that she would never forgive her for what she had done. But hate isn't always permanent. Sometimes, when people lose, they don't become bitter. They become humble. "Why are you calling, Mom?" I asked, cutting to the point. Another pause. Then, softly, "James told me, you're expecting a girl." I stiffened. We hadn't told many people yet. Just a few close friends. My mother hadn't been one of them. "Yeah," I said cautiously. "Mary's due in March." Silence. Then, softer than I'd ever heard her. "I'd like to meet her." The words were so quiet I almost didn't believe them. My mother had spent years believing family was about legacy, about control, about power. But now she was learning that family is about something else entirely. I hesitated, glancing back through the glass doors of the office. Mary was watching me, her expression unreadable. I turned away again, rubbing the back of my neck. "Mom, if you're going to be in our lives, things have to be different." A long pause. Then, quietly, "I know." For the first time in a long time, I believed her. I let out a slow breath, leaning against the railing. "Then we'll try." Another silence. But this time, it wasn't cold. It was hopeful. After we hung up, I stood there for a long time, watching the city skyline, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Not just because the war was over, but because, maybe, just maybe, something new was beginning. When I stepped back into the office, Mary raised an eyebrow. "Well?" she asked. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "She wants to meet the baby." Mary was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "We'll see," she said simply. That was fair. She had spent years fighting for her place in this family. It was my mother's turn to prove she deserved a second chance. I walked over, wrapping my arms around Mary's waist. She leaned into me, her head resting against my chest. We stood there for a long time, the weight of the past finally starting to lift. My mother had once tried to destroy Mary, believing she wasn't worthy of our family name. But in the end, it was Mary who redefined what that name meant. And she did it without my mother's permission. As we stood there, I realized something. Power isn't about destroying others. It's about building something unbreakable. And Mary had done exactly that. Not just in business, but in our family. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the future anymore.